Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Yan, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today is Tuesday, February 24th, 2026, and this is the fifth session in the e-lecture series entitled Applied Research Perspectives Across the Canadian Forest Service. The series is a collaborative effort coordinated between the Canadian Forest Service and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate and host these webinars. For today's session, we are pleased to welcome Mathieu Fortin, Chris Hennigar, Isabelle Auger, and Hugues Power, who will present tangible jurisdictional examples of integrating climate sensitivity into growth and yield models. To start us off, Mathieu Fortin is a research scientist in forest biometrics at the Larchel Forestry Center. He earned his PhD from Laval University in 2006 and joined the Canadian Forest Service in 2019. His research focuses on stochastic growth models, upscaling techniques, and statistical estimation, with a strong interest in implementing models into software. Next, Chris Hennigar brings over 20 years of experience across the forest sector, including private consulting, collaborative research, and 10 years with the New Brunswick Department of Natural Resources. He joined the Canadian Forest Service at Atlantic Forestry Center in January 2025 and has been working toward the development of climate-sensitive forest growth and yield models for Canada. Joining him, Hugues Power is a forest engineer who graduated from Laval University in 1998 and completed a PhD in biological sciences at the University of Quebec in Montreal in 2013. Since 2012, he has been employed by the Quebec Ministry of Natural Resources and Forest as a researcher in forest growth and yield modeling. His work focuses on the development of modeling tools to support sustainable forest management. Although she's not presenting today, I would like to note that Isabelle Auger is also a member of the project team. Isabelle completed her bachelor's and master's degrees in statistics at Laval University and joined the Quebec Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests in 1999 as a statistician. Her work includes developing forest growth models and providing statistical expertise in modeling. With that, I will now pass it over to Mathieu to begin today's presentation.
So thank you very much for inviting us to give this talk today. So we intend to provide some examples of how climate sensitivity can be integrated in growth and yield models in general and their components. Without further ado, I will start. Okay, so we'll go through three main topics or main sections in this presentation. So first of all, we're going to address a bit of climate change, give a bit of background on climate change itself and also methodological issues. The second part will be really about those examples I was talking about. And finally, the third part is really how it can be implemented in forest management planning. So what justified the need for climate sensitive models? So you all know that climate is changing. And I remember when I started my career, first models I fit were during my master degree, in 1998, something like that. And it was something that was really remote, a very far away idea that climate was changing. And it was not really, we're not really thinking about it. And we were still working under this assumption that growth and yield, if you have some permanent plots and you have a long monitoring, it's the past is a guarantee, is a warrant of the future, as we say. And now we realize that things are not as stable as they were. Climate is changing, and that's a huge paradigm shift. So just to give you an idea, it's probably something you've already seen. We have those climate scenarios that are called SSP. So it stands for Shared Socioeconomic Pathway. Before they were called RCP for Representative Concentration Pathway, but basically those are the same. They're same thing. We have basically a climate scenario. In the best case, we're going to have a 1.5 degree above the mean annual temperature that was observed before the industrial era. And in the worst case scenario, it's going to be close, well, slightly above 5 degrees. That's something really unprecedented. And just to give you an idea of what what are the implications of that? If you live around Toronto, for example, you have a mean annual temperature close to 8 degrees. And if you look, if we're focusing on the SSP2 here, okay, it means an increase of something close, I'll go back here, something close to 3 degrees with respect to the pre-industrial era. You have to go south, about 300 kilometers south, to find a temperature that could be the one that will be in Toronto at the end of the 21st century. And if we're looking for the worst case scenario, the SSP 5, 8.5, the one that was above 5 degrees at the end of the 21st century, you have to go close to Washington to find a climate that would be the one similar to what we're going to have in Toronto at the end of the 21st century. So you have basically to fly 500 kilometers south to find this sort of climate that we would expect in Toronto at the end of the 21st century. So it obviously has tremendous implications on models. And speaking of model, there are many classifications, but I would like to distinguish two or maybe three different types of models based on the approach that is used. So we have on the left-hand side those models that are based on statistical regression, where we tried based on ground truth data from permanent sample plot. We predict the growth from the tree size, for example, and the competition and variables of that sort. But there is no consideration for the physiological processes, as opposed to process-based models, which are really focused on explicitly represent those physiological processes. And we have a third category, hybrid models. So the one here on the right-hand side is actually a hybrid model. A big part of it is process-based and a small part of it is empirical. But you can see that as we move from empirical to process-based and hybrid models, we increase the complexity. So the empirical model on the left-hand side, although it has many boxes, remain much simpler than what you can see on the right-hand side. In forest management planning, we're still largely using empirical models because they're much easier to implement. You can use them with regular inventory data, and they do not rely on many assumptions regarding, or they provide the basic variables that we need basically to run those empirical models. So that makes them more user-friendly, I'd say. Regarding methodological issues, what are the impact, or how can we implement climate sensitivity in our different models? There was this literature review by Mathieu 2 years ago, and I participated, I contributed to that paper. So we went through more than 100 papers, close to 200 papers actually, and tried to classify what are the different climate sensitivity implementation. And we came up with 4 categories. So I just kept the first one, which is the no climate sensitivity. So your model relies on the idea or the assumption that the climate is constant over time. You can actually rely on an indirect climate sensitivity. And that's probably one of the first approaches that was used to put some climate to take the climate into account in our model. So basically, if you have one input variable that is really important, like the site index, and you could express this site index as you can basically fit your site index with some climate variables. You make your site index climate sensitive. You can induce some climate sensitivity in your growth models. This has some limitation, of course, because if your site index is increasing due to climate, everything is going to increase. And whereas we could think that if you have a model with different components like mortality, survivor growth, recruitment, it could turn out that the temperature is an increase in temperature is beneficial for survivor growth, but is detrimental or cause more mortality, for example. So a second approach is actually this average climate sensitivity that we use a lot when when we work with permanent sample plot. We use 30-year normals or interval average climate sensitivity. So if you have the temperature measured on 20 years and you have a 20-year measurement, that would be the average over the interval. And finally, we have this third category, which is the annual climate sensitivity, where you rely on the annual variables. Um, that said, I don't want to, I put them here in order, but there is no really, it doesn't mean that the annual climate sensitivity is always better than an average climate sensitivity. And I'll come back to that later on. So in the same literature review, we look at the different empirical models and process-based and hybrid models in Canada, and we classified them according to that. So among the empirical models, there were 15 that were listed in the paper, and 9 were climate insensitive, although they could be easily changed using the first approach of indirect climate sensitivity. 6 already included some indirect or average sensitivity, and none included annual climate sensitivity. That was a contrast compared to the process-based and hybrid models, which all relied on the annual climate sensitivity. That's not an exhaustive list of what is being done in Canada, and there are other models, but those were the ones we considered in the paper. So fundamentally, if we look at a tree response to climate, there are some natural hypotheses that come to mind. So think that if the temperature is a limiting factor, you're at the northern edge of the species distribution, the climate is cold, the seasonal growth period is really short, so temperature is really limiting. So an increase in temperature would then cause an increase in growth. That's true, but to a certain extent. So here, I'm sorry about the quality of this picture. I have this Barnes et al. Book here, and I could not find a better illustration, so I decided to scan it. But it shows basically the net photosynthesis according to the temperature. So it increases, of course, when you're close to zero. There is no, or photosynthesis is really, really low. And as you increase temperature, it's going to increase. And there's really this optimal range between, let's say, 17 and 30 degrees, where the net photosynthesis is really at its maximum. And then respiration increases with temperature, so that the net photosynthesis decreases as the temperature increases. So we don't have this linear relationship, but rather something that is bell-shaped. And we need to take this into account when we want to implement some climate sensitivity. So temperature is not the only climate-related factor that matters. Water too. So you can have the optimal temperature, but no water. It's going to be hard for your trees to grow. So there's water in the soil. Of course, we have the soil moisture. So we have mesic drainage that is typically thought as being the best, and from xeric drainage, it's become limiting. And when we have peatland, where the drainage is really is very slow, it can cause limiting conditions to tree growth. But there's also the water content of air. So it's been shown that an increased atmospheric dryness reduces tree growth for at least for the boreal forest, and this is most of the time measured as through a variable that might ring a bell for some of you. It's called the vapor pressure deficit. So the higher the vapor pressure deficit, the VPD, we call it, the drier the air is. And when the air is really dry, the stomata close and the trees stop doing photosynthesis. So that can be a limiting factor as well, and we need to take that into account. So models are strongly tied to data, and this is where the geographical distribution of your data matters a lot. For example, in Quebec and Ontario, if we consider only this part, and if we only have those data here within the blue circle, the real response might be bell-shaped, as we see here in the graph on the left-hand side. But what we're going to cover is what is in the blue circle on the right-hand side. So we're going to fit a model and see a linear trend related to the mean summer temperature, which means that we increase the mean summer temperature and the 5-year diameter increment is going to increase as well. But at a certain point, when we exceed the distribution of our data and we are further south, we're going to get something that is really overestimating the true response. And if we do the same for the center of the distribution, we might not see any effect at all. It's because we're at the top of this bell-shaped curve. And the same thing happens if we are in the southern part of the species distribution here. If we increase the temperature, it's just going to increase the respiration, and photosynthesis is going to decline. The net photosynthesis is going to decline, might be drier hair as well. So in the end, we're going to capture this here, and we might find a linear trend that will, at some point, maybe an extrapolation will even result in negative 5-year diameter increment. So it really matters to cover the whole species distribution. We also rely for space for time assumption. So what does that mean? We're working with permanent sample plot and well, tree-ring data as well to fit growth models. And we expect that at the end of the 21st century, just to go back to this Toronto example I was giving a couple of slides ago, we expect at the end of the 21st century that the trees close to Toronto will grow like those close to Washington. That's what we expect. But that's 500 kilometers south. And actually, when you look at the species distribution, it's really on the southern edge of it. So in some cases, for some other species, this it leads you to a climate that is unprecedented, that is not represented in your data set. Basically, here in Washington, we're close to the edge, but if we were just a little bit further south, there is no sugar maple growing there. So it's hard to tie this to a space for time assumption if there are no trees growing there. And by using this assumption, a major criticism is that we do not take into account the phenotypic plasticity. So it means that the trees in the southern part, close to Washington, they're probably adapted to those high temperatures. But those in Toronto, they might lack the phenotypic plasticity to grow like those close to Washington. So we're not taking this into account. That said, we do not entirely rely on the space for time substitution because we have monitorings that are quite, well, in some cases, we have close to 70 years of monitoring. But, well, even if those are 70 years, if you look at the increase in temperature 70 years ago, we were at minus 0.5, and today we are at plus 0.5 compared to the historical data. Compared to the 1995 period here. So we have something like a 1 degree increase that we can already observe on the same location in our data, but that's nothing compared to a 5 degree increase that is predicted in the worst case scenario, that is with the SSB 8.5. So it's coming, but it's not enough today just to get rid of this space for time substitution. So let's jump into those tangible examples of climate sensitive models. So I want to go in chronological order. So I said at the beginning of the presentation, when I fitted my first model, it was at the end of the 90s, and we were not thinking really about climate change. So in the early 2000s, some people really thought, okay, we have to do something in terms of, and I'm talking about people working in empirical modeling, people working with process-based and hybrid models that have been thinking about integrating climate for a long time. But it just happened at the beginning of the 2000 that you can see the first example of climate sensitive site index. So here is an example in Alberta. And you can see on the graph here on the right-hand side panel here, those are the site index today. And if we look at that time in 2020, so it was, well, I guess that the data were probably dating from the 2000s. So 20 years later, there would be a site index much higher. So the greener the color, the higher the site index here. So all that zone here that was not where we would not have any site index, then it would become suitable and trees would basically grow faster. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that those climate sensitive site index are used in the Gypsy model, but I might be wrong. And if I'm wrong, please let me know in the chat. That's something also we thought in Quebec. I was working for the provincial government at that time, and we were fitting an allometric relationship, a high diameter relationship. And we thought at that time, oh, maybe there is an effect of climate. And we came up with this here. Oh, a positive linear effect. And I mean, the industry really liked this sort of effect because over time it means that your trees, all other things considered, they are slanted taller. So it means more volume, basically. As the mean annual temperature increases, you get more volume. And we see that this high diameter relationship has been implemented with the Artemis model, which is used in Quebec. And we can see that whenever we increase the temperature, the mean annual temperature, we get higher volume. But that's clearly a case of extrapolation, as I showed you previously. We were working only with the data from Quebec. We're at the northern edge of most species distribution, like this. So, and from 2010, well, I would say 2015, around that, we started to see explicit examples of climate sensitive components of models. So if you're using a stand level model, you can use, for example, a site index, climate sensitive site index. But if you're using a tree level model where you explicitly predict mortality, recruitment, and the growth of survivor trees, you can put some climate sensitivity in each one of those. So we started to see some examples of, and that's what I'm going to go through in the next slides. We're going to see different examples of climate sensitive mortality, climate sensitive survivor growth, and climate sensitive recruitment. So if we start with climate sensitive tree survival mortality, so or survival here. Okay, so we've got an example in Western Canada, which published in 2017 by Cortini et al. And they were working with 7 species there. And you can see that the survival increases with the CMI, stands for climate moisture index. So the higher the moisture, we get a better survival or a lower mortality for all species except one, which is really weird when you think about it. And that species is PL, the lodgepole pine here. So it means the more moisture you have, basically, the lower the survival probability is. So which is a bit counterintuitive. We ran a similar study in Ontario. It's been published last year, and we obtained similar results for other species. Here you have, you need well, the difference between the graph on the left-hand side, you have the survival, on the right-hand side, you have the probability. So if you want to look at them, you would have to flip one upside down. But that's here, what we took into account in the model was the total precipitation for the summer period. And for 2 species here, black spruce and jack pine, an increase in those precipitation, the summer precipitation, would result in an increased mortality, which is again a bit counterintuitive. That was really puzzling, and we started to dig a little bit in the literature to see if there were other examples of that. So Hugues Bauer who's going to present a few slides later in this presentation, also worked on the probability on the mortality model for Quebec, and again, the climate moisture index entered in the model, and for yellow birch, we would observe again this counterintuitive trend where a more moisture results into a higher probability of mortality. There's an extensive, well, a very large study that was carried out by Robbie Amber in 2017, where they looked at he and the co-authors looked at 64 species in North America, and they tested different variables. And the W here is the water content of the soil. So they modeled the mortality. So they would expect that, and they expected that the higher the water content, basically the lower the mortality would be. And they reported their result as percentage. So 55% of the 64 species, so probably something around 36 of those, gave the expected trend. So they corroborated their hypothesis. So you increase the water content of the soil, you decrease the mortality. Still, there was a quarter of the species where they actually found the opposite. So you decrease the water content of the soil, you increase the mortality, and that's not negligible. And that brings a lot of questions on, can we have hypotheses that we can generalize to all the species? And here, for the mortality, the answer is clearly no. See, a quarter of the species would not follow this general pattern we would expect as a response to a greater moisture content. So let's move to the survivor growth. Again, in 2018, for Quebec, Loïc d'Orangeville and some collaborators worked on different scenarios for, I think it was for 6 species. And they came up with, according to different climate scenario, if we decrease slightly the precipitation, we increase by 2 degrees Celsius the mean annual temperature, or we increase by 4 degrees, and you can see different patterns that were, in that case, they are really consistent. So it becomes drier in Western Quebec, so it's really detrimental to growth. So the greener the color, the better the growth is relative to the baseline scenario. Baseline scenario being no change at all. So how it's growing today. So the white birch would do well here in northern Quebec because it becomes more suitable, but less good in southern Quebec because we lose in suitability there. They also extended their data set and worked on the basal area increment for Canada and northeastern USA, and came with, and that's really interesting here because we're starting to see, for at least one species for white spruce, we're starting to see this bell-shaped response here, the one that we would expect for most, well, for many species. So we can see that there is actually a maximum summer temperature that is optimal here, probably around 24 degrees, that it maximizes the basal area increment of white spruce. Climate sensitive tree growth, again, a study in Western Canada, where they obtain counterintuitive results again. So here they use the frost-free period as a predictor for the diameter growth. And what you can see, you've got the blue line, a frost-free period of 120 days. So it's warmer than the black line, where we only have 90 days of frost-free period here. And you can see that it's basically colder. It grows better for jack pine. So again, that's not something we can generalize for all species. Some species seems to require some cold temperature, whereas others do better when the climate gets warmer. One thing that we found, and we worked again on tree recruitment on diameter increment in Quebec, and one trend that we found, one variable for which we found a common trend was actually the climate moisture index on tree growth here. It was really for all the species where the variable entered in the model, we had this positive effect, except for sugar maple, Asasacarum here, it was a bit quadratic. But let's say that it's a pattern that seems, that's an effect that seems to be generalized to the species here. What about climate sensitive recruitment? Recruitment depends on, is the habitat suitable or not? And when it is suitable, there are competition factors that will eventually decrease your probability of recruitment. And also something that is really important and that we need to take into account in the future is, are there adult trees to provide seeds nearby? So it means that the climate can make a particular site suitable, but if there are no seeds that reach that site, there won't be any tree of that species growing there, right? So that's something we've tried to take into account in a recruitment model here. And we can see that the degree days was, we could find a sort of envelope here where there was a maximum or an optimal growing degree days that would maximize the probability of recruiting a species of a particular, recruiting a tree of a particular species. And when we look at the occupancy index is actually in the 10 kilometers around a site, what is the probability, or how many plots, if you would populate this area with as many plots as possible, how many plots would actually have a tree of that species? So it gives you roughly an idea of the abundance of the species in the landscape around a particular location. So, and you can see that this occupancy index when it decreases, of course, it's detrimental to the probability of occurrence. And we hope that this sort of model here, when you put it in a simulator, will make it possible to take into account the migration lag. So the climate is just moving north faster than the species can. And yeah, and let's see, we'll see if we manage to reproduce that sort of pattern. But here is the idea. By taking the occupancy index into account, we think that we might eventually be able to reproduce this lag. So in terms of synthesis, we have a great deal of variability in climate variable selection across the studies and within the studies. And we cannot generalize in many cases. There are only a few cases, and that's really a personal experience. You might not agree with me, but from my own experience, a greater moisture content was generally leads to a greater diameter increments for well, the vast majority of the species. And there's also a clear link between degree days and tree recruitment. When you work with mortality effects of water temperature, they may vary across the species a lot, and they can even be in the opposite direction. You would expect them to be beneficial for survival, and they're actually detrimental. So let's now move on to the third part of this presentation, the implementation in forest management planning. What about the long-term projection? So empirical, that's what we're looking for in forest management planning. Okay, we're not restricted to this 20, 30 years. We would like, in some cases, to assess the sustainability of management strategies. So we need to see on the longer term, maybe 50 to 60 years. So empirical models are not bound to any physiological process, as I said early on in this presentation. But we're tied to ground truth, and we have this sort of monitoring for over 20, 30 years. So we can expect that over the next 20, 30 years, if we take the climate into account, we might not miss the mark by much. We might be close to it. However, in the long term, we might be in the extrapolation range and clearly miss the target over 50 to 60 years. And this is where we see a synergy with hybrid and process-based model. Process-based and hybrid models are tied to physiological process, which means that probably they might rely on some other assumptions, especially for mortality, that make them not as reliable as empirical model in the short term, but maybe they bring more information in the long term. And you can see some example in the literature, and I put here 2 examples. One of them where they really use a process-based model to run long-term projections. That was in Albert et al. And Johnson et al., which was published recently. I think it was published a couple of weeks ago, not more than that, where they use the VDYP model in BC, and they readjusted the predictions using a process-based model. So they basically readjusted those predictions to implement the climate sensitivity in the VDYP system. I'm going to pass it over to Hugues. So Hugues, just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Mathieu. So I just want to highlight you a few points that need to be taken into account when we think about using climate-sensitive growth model in forest management. First of these points is related to the ecological classification. So the ecological classification is a useful tool for forest management. And it is a useful tool mainly because it is closely linked to forest productivity and species composition of the forest stands. And for these reasons, ecological classification is often used in forest growth model. For example, in Quebec, two of our main models, Natura and Artemis, used different variables derived from Quebec's ecological classification. However, if we want to include a climate variable in the model, the fact that ecological classification variable are already present, they can limit the sensitivity of the model. So next slide, Mathieu. So what you see on the slide is an example of two different climate variables. On the left side, you have the mean annual temperature, and on the right side, the total annual precipitation. And you see box plots of the distribution of these variables across different forest types. This is an example from Quebec. And what we see that there's a correlation between the forest type, which is a variable that is derived from the ecological classification, with the climate variables. And it is strongly the case, well, really a strong correlation for mean annual temperature. This is what you see on the left slide. So if you want, for example, to include mean annual temperature in the forest growth model, you may have a misrepresentation of this variable, the model, if forest type is already in the model. And this is the case because a large part of the variation that you want to explain with the mean annual temperature will be already taken into account by the forest type. So this is something to think about when you build a climate-sensitive growth and yield model. Next slide, Mathieu. So models are often used at the landscape level to derive growth curves. And these growth curves are used by forest managers to build the management plans. So the growth curves are normally linked to a forest territory. And they are used to first to predict the evolution of the volume of each stand that is located on this territory. Next slide. So we see here an example of a growth curve. This example, again, comes from Quebec. This is a growth curve for a balsam fir stand in Quebec. And growth curves, generally, it's basically a relationship between the volume and the stand age. And when we build growth curve, we consider that this relationship is constant over time. And doing this assumption, it makes it possible to think that the stands that are younger are going to grow along the line of the growth curve to meet the volume of the stands that are older. So it's a really convenient assumption. But if we think that the climate change will change forest productivity, then this assumption is no longer relevant. So the relationship between volume and age will not be constant, but we need to think about this relationship more as a relationship between volume, age, and a calendar year. So as we can see here on the slide, we may think that the original curve that is in black in the figure on the right may be located at different places according to the calendar year. And this is a challenge for forest managers who want to use climate-sensitive growth curve. Next slide. Another element to take into account is the fact that the effect of climate on productivity may differ according to the stand age. And there are some examples in the scientific literature that let us think that it made a case. So if it is a case, and as we see on the figure on the right, the effect of climate on a stand of 30 years could be different than, for example, for a stand of 50 years. So we will need to change the way we do the stratification prior of building the growth curves. Next slide, Mathieu. Really common way to stratify the territory in order to build growth curves is to consider the forest cover type. In this example, we have balsam fir, the site productivity, and its location. But we may also have to add the stand age in our criteria to build to stratify, to build management stratum to build growth curves. So it may be it will complexify the stratification and the use of the growth curves. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugues. I'll pass it over to Chris Hennigar to give you an example of how balsam fir decline was taken into account in forest management.
Yeah, so I just want to present a real quick case study here, kind of what to do if your climate sensitive growth model doesn't really have climate sensitivity at all. So in New Brunswick, we have a growth model called OSM, open stand model, and it was being used at the time, still is, but during the development of the 2022 Crown Forest Management Plans. And at the time, I was in that team building those growth curves and that forest management planning model. And a lot of folks were observing a decline in balsam fir in the south of New Brunswick for a variety of reasons. Just next slide there, Mathieu. So, we identified a large number of things that were causing that decline. From warmer winters to droughts to ice damage and balsam woolly adelgid, butt rot, ants, you name it. Everything seemed to be affecting fir. And it did seem to be limited to the south. And so we knew we needed to adjust the yield curves. And so we went through an exercise where we used a lot of expert opinion to do this. And I think it's a good case study of, when you have incomplete information and you need to react quickly because you're in the middle of a management planning process, what do you do? And so I'll just explain kind of the approach we took. We got industry together and we went out with both government and industry to a number of different sites, and we started looking at these stands and trying to identify what was going on. Was it the spruce declining too, or was it just the fir? And we noticed that the fir was really growing fine right up until about 20 centimeters DBH. And then that's when the butt rot would really kick in. And that's about the size, when you hit 23 centimeters-ish, you're starting to get into sawlog material. So, we wanted to make some surgical adjustments to these yields at the tree level. So next slide, Mathieu. And I'll just say this was predominantly in pre-commercial thin stands. So we did make adjustments in plantations and naturally regenerating stands also, but to a lesser extent. A lot of the fir in the PCTs in southern New Brunswick are quite old fir, but we were starting to see declines around age 30 in those stands. And OSM has a nice language associated with it that allows for these very surgical adjustments in growth. And so we went through a number of different scenarios where we were able to start making adjustments to diameter increment, height increment, and mortality rates for specific species and specific diameter ranges. And we were able to ramp those up over time with the anticipation of climate change having more of an effect over time. Next slide. And so I'm showing 3 scenarios here. We went through probably 5 or 6 different scenarios. We got the marketing boards involved, industry, and we had a few different meetings, and we presented these simulation results. And folks generally gravitated towards the green line, kind of a high impact scenario where we really increased mortality rates when that tree reached, or the stand reached 30 years old, and the trees were starting to climb above 20 centimeters dBH. So fairly quick mortality rates and decline within 5 or 10 years after that. And so we integrated these curves into the wood supply model, and that had some impact on AAC. So, it's like, ideally, we want to base these models more on empirical evidence, but sometimes you just don't have it at your fingertips and you've got to react. And I think a good example of building something like this into planning would be for, like, invasive insects, where you've got a new insect that has emerged and it's making rapid changes to specific species within the stand. So like emerald ash borer, for example. So it's fairly easy within a modeling environment like this to kill those ash over the next 5 or 10 years. So for any climate sensitive growth and yield model, there's got to be some mechanisms in there to be able to play around with some of the assumptions of those mortality and growth rates to make those quick adjustments for these sometimes unexpected cases. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Mathieu.
Thank you, Chris. So it's now time to wrap this presentation. So the takeaway messages, there are several ways of implementing climate sensitivity, different temporal resolution. We told you about, having this indirect climate sensitivity, those interval average climate variables, or those annual climate variables. There's also several limitations. The geographical extent of the data is really important, and this is why if you attended 2 weeks ago, there was this presentation given by Chris on the data we're gathering to cover whole Canada and northern US. It's really important to cover the species distribution. But even if we have the species distribution, in some cases, we're going to be in the extrapolation zone, because the climate warming, if we follow the worst case scenario, we'll probably end up at the end of the 21st century in conditions that are not observed right now in the species distribution, in the species envelope. There's also species-specific response to climate. It's hard to generalize, especially regarding mortality. There were a lot of cases, a lot of species where the response was really counterintuitive, but that's what it is. It's supported by data. And regarding the implementation in forest management planning, the unit growth curve for a particular forest type is no longer relevant. The calendar year is now important and should be taken into account. We might end up having a growth surface instead of a growth curve for each particular forest type. I distinguished 2 types of model early on, 3 types of models, empirical models, process-based models, and hybrid models. And I mean, we don't have the luxury of reject any of those 3 approaches. All models bring a piece of information that can be valuable. This is why we're now talking more about ensembles of models. If we could use as many models as possible for decision making, we're facing unprecedented change. So all models can bring something. So what is really important, though, if we're using a lot of models, is the transparency. We need to know what are the strengths and weaknesses of all those models, on what sort of data they've been fitted, and so on. And in cases where we don't have any information, using assumptions based on expert judgment, as Chris showed, are better than nothing. And actually, they should be preferred to the no change scenario. So something is happening. We don't have the luxury to wait for ground plot to provide information. Then we have to rely on expert judgment. And I just want to bring your attention on the climate change scenario that are provided by the IPCC. You can see the numbers here: 51, 11, 30, 33, 26, and 32. Those are the number of models that were run in order to get each one of those scenarios here, and to evaluate the uncertainty related to each one of them. So this is really a goal I think we should try to achieve in forestry, although I doubt one day we'll reach those numbers. But if we could get, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 models for a particular context, that would be great. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any question, I think you can ask them in the chat. Thank you again.
So we have one question at this moment. You mentioned that growth curves based on forest types are no longer relevant. Does that mean folks should be emphasizing more tree-level growth modeling as opposed to standard stand-level models?
I can start with that question, and Chris and Hugues, if you want to jump in. That's a good question, actually. And I think in the ideal world, we would like to run our simulation to support our management planning using a tree-level model. However, it turns out that we don't have the data to feed those models everywhere in the landscape, over the forest management unit, I mean. So at the moment, it's hardly doable. You can use some imputation technique to predict what would be the tree list there in that location here to feed your model, but you lose track of the uncertainty if you do that. I mean, it would be great if you could do that, but I think in the short term, given the capacity and the information we have, we still have to rely on growth curves. And those growth curves, they can be derived from tree level growth modeling, but that's different. You can use a tree level model to produce growth curves. That's what most people do. They do that in New Brunswick with OSM. We do that also in Quebec with Artemis. But in the end, we're using, the prediction of our model. We abstract them into curves, and we're not running the tree level model every time we want to know something about the evolution of a stand, for example. So the short answer, I think it's not doable to use it because we don't have the resource and the information in the short term. We still have to rely on growth curves. And that should eventually be growth surfaces.
And I'll just add quickly to that, yeah, I think we're still going to have to simplify the forest down to forest types, but you think of a stand type like a fir spruce stand, and the fir is probably going to be impacted a lot more than the spruce by climate change. So a tree level model is very advantageous for that kind of simulation, where you can impact that fir separately from the spruce. And that just increases as you get into more complex stand types. So I think a tree level model is really key for a climate sensitive model.
Thank you all for participating in our CIF electronic lectures. And once again, thank you very much to Mathieu, Chris, and Hugues, and Isabelle for the great presentation. Bye, everyone.